Okay, questions, anything? All right. Assignments due Thursday. So I'll talk as we go on. I'll talk about the article a bit. But we'll go through it. But any questions about the assignment before we dive in? All right. So you recall last time we were talking about starting to get into where research ideas came from, mentioned the idea of qualitative analysis, said that qualitative analysis is kind of a way of one way it can be used is in terms of hypothesis generation. And then we started to go through kind of just, think about, at least the way I think about qualitative analysis is in these three ways. So basically how to use qualitative analysis. So one is that you can read qualitative studies where they're standalone studies. This is particularly, there are certain topics that are better for just a qualitative study than a quantitative study. But just remember that qualitative studies don't give you prevalence, right? They don't, so you can't make statements about the population or about, you can't take it in and make populations about statements about the wider populations based on a qualitative study. That's where quantitative studies come in. Quantitative studies, the idea is that, they're supposed to be able to tell you things about the larger population as opposed to just the people that you talk to. So that's one way, use qualitative study alone, but just be careful not to make inferences about the population. A second way is that you do a quantitative survey followed by a qualitative study. So this is one where you would, do a survey first, and then you find some results that are that you don't understand. And so then you follow up with small groups of people just to discuss those results. And the third is you use qualitative first and then quantitative. So the idea here is that you use qualitative as kind of your hypothesis generation, and then you go through and you do a quantitative survey based on it. All right, then we talked at length about Rudy's dissertation. Rudy, you done with that dissertation yet? No? Okay. Every day I'll ask you, every day when you come in. I tell you that's what my wife got our youngest son to do, because she finished her dissertation before mine, and so he was only 2. And so she told him to say, "Are you done with your dissertation yet?" So every day I came home, it's like, "No, I'm not done yet." Okay. So then we started going through, and remember, the idea, there's different types of sampling, and we're going to talk about sampling today in general, but there's different types of sampling for qualitative studies. And so we started to go through this article. So let's switch over and just look at that article for a second. Let's see. So this is the one I gave you, which is privacy issues and development of virtual mental health clinic for university students. So structured or unstructured? Abstract? Structured. So it kind of starts pretty much the same way, where it goes through in that, you start off with opening statement, and then it kind of starts to, by the end of the first paragraph, you're sort of narrowing what the study's about. And then, typically you go to the end of the introduction, and that will tell you kind of what they're doing. So it's usually the same in qualitative studies too. Qualitative studies don't have hypotheses usually that they're testing, so that they usually don't say that we're examining whether this or that, right? But instead, the whole idea of qualitative is to explore things, explore ideas. So they typically say things like, that they're investigate issues, or that they'll, identify common themes or things like that. We'll come up with qualitative. Sample. It talks about how they get their sample. There it is. So they had a couple of different groups, focus groups. And those also is that, in the qualitative papers, is that in the method section, they basically tell you how many people that they sampled. And oftentimes they'll tell you characteristics of the people. And that goes in the method section, whereas in quantitative papers, that information usually goes in table 1 of the results section. The reason why they put it in the method section and not in the results section is because in the quantitative papers, what you're looking for to see if the population, the sample that they got is blank to the population. That is, that you're looking to see whether it's a representative sample, right? You're looking to see whether it's a representative sample. And we'll talk about that today. Where in qualitative, there's no kind of sense of representativeness. Instead, they're looking for different types of things. So there's a snowball sampling or the diversity sampling or things like that. So there'll be different types of sampling that they use in qualitative. And then when they get down here to the results, so it's set up in the results sections of qualitative papers are typically, like this, where you start, and then you'll say, and so here's your first theme, right? Providing minimal information, and they'll describe it, the theme, and then they give a quote. And the quote then comes from the actual transcripts. So like when we do qualitative studies, we record them, and then we transcribe them, and then we go through and code them using, like there's a program called Deduce, which is a qualitative program that you can use to code. So you go through and code them. And then what you do is you end up with these themes, and then you also end up with the like little quotes that kind of highlight the theme. So like in this case, then what they do when they write a paper is they decide on the themes they want to go through and talk about, but then they bring out some quotes. So that's why you'll see it all has the same type of pattern: theme, quote, then theme, quote here, and it goes on that way. So then goes on and on and on. And qualitative papers are often longer because you do have sort of lots more quotes that you put in along the way. So then discussion, same basic idea as with the quantitative paper. Starts off by saying, it's like sort of summarizing what it is that they found in the paper that they concluded. And then, oftentimes in the second part, someplace down here, they start to talk about how this reinforces or differs from other things that have been found. And then they'll go into limitations, right? Limitations, so in the discussion section, always will have a section for limitations where you talk about either the problems that you have in terms of sampling or that just the overall limitations of the study. And at the end, you have some type of conclusion, or what you have is that you'll have policy implications or implications for clinical practice, or depending upon the journal. So like some journals, like medical journals that cater to doctors and to health professionals, oftentimes at the end they'll have implications for clinical practice. And that's where you're supposed to say, like in a short thing. The idea being is that if a doctor picks this up and reads it, they'll just go to that section and say, okay, what's the implication here? And just only read that. Then finally, abstracts, and then also like here, all the focus group and things like that, the questions. So, in online, everything's online now for these journals. So they don't actually publish usually all the materials that went with it. But what they'll do is the journal will ask the authors to submit it. And so then you can go there on their website and that you can download all the materials. Okay, questions about qualitative papers or set up? Okay. Qualitative, we talked a little bit about how you sample, and we said that it differs from quantitative, and that quantitative is looking for a representative sample. So what I want to do today is basically just go through and give you some general points about sampling, but then we're going to go through some papers, through some different types of examples. So to me, this is the most interesting thing about reading research papers, is just looking at how they sample. because oftentimes, it looks like it's fairly straightforward. In fact, I just reviewed a paper the other day for a journal, and when I first read through the paper, I thought, oh, this is fine, good paper, everything else. And then I got to, then what you do when you review a journal is that you read through it, and then you make comments, and then you type those comments in that they have comments to the authors and comments to the editors. And so the comments to the authors, they're blinded, so they don't know who you are. So this is the place where if someone wants to be a jerk, they'll like write jerky comments to the authors. And they can also then write jerky comments about the paper to the editors. But that's where, if you hear people talk about that they got bad reviews from their submitting their article, it'll be in that place there. Like I've had some bad reviews in my day, some jerky reviews. I've had bad reviews and that they rejected the articles. I've had jerky reviews too, whereby, like someone wrote one time and said, the opening line was, "What have I done to deserve being sent this paper?" It's like, wow, really? So people can kind of be a bit, we'll just call them jerks in that section. But the idea is that that as you go through that and write these comments, that's typically where you sort of think things out. And so like in this case, it turned out that their sampling was really, really off. And, and I didn't really realize it until I actually went through and started to just sort of think about, well, so what's the problems with the paper? So that's why in going through these papers, oftentimes it's when you get to the sampling is the place where you start to see you start to see the problems that are going to arise in the paper. Okay. There's also, I read an article one time where they talked to a bunch of Nobel Prize winners. So these are people like, they've hit the top of the field, and they were, interviewing them for something. And so the interviews were kind of boring until they got to the question where they said, have you had any papers rejected that you didn't think should have been rejected? And every one of them suddenly got really animated. In fact, a lot of times their most seminal works are things that were rejected initially. Because often, when they send out these reviews, sometimes they send out reviews to people, who don't know that much about the field or whatever. And so they can, reject these papers that then go on to be, kind of very, very, very important. And every one of them was so passionate about how pissed off they were after all these years, after getting a Nobel Prize, at some of the rejections that they got. Okay. This is all in chapter 5 of your book. So look at chapter 5. So sampling is what we do. And the idea of sampling is to get a representative group from your population of study. So representative means now is that it's got the same type of characteristics as your population group. And your population in this case means that it is not necessarily the entire population, but it's the group that the group that you're interested in. So for example, if I want to do something to look at stress among university students, I wouldn't go out and survey the general population, right? Who would I sample? Who's my population in that sense? Yeah, either undergraduates or graduate students, but university students. All university students. That is that, would I care about students from all universities? Or would I be specific about what students I care about? So let's say if I wanted to know, well, take the COVID paper that we read, right? The one about stress in students. Who did they sample? Say that loud. Yeah, students at UCI. And so so their population is university students at, their population is university students, right? And they did students at UCI. Are students at UCI representative of all students? Probably not. I think probably students at Merced College are different than students at UCI. So it's a question about, well, so what is their population? Is their sample of UCI students representative of all students at all universities? And is that a problem that the answer is no? It is a problem that it's not. Does it invalidate the study? But how do you think UCI students are different from Merced College students? Mm-hmm. And is that important?
Yeah.
Why? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's right. So maybe it's that students who are going to Merced College are more likely to live at home, right? They're going to be commuter students, right, who go to Merced College. It's a 2-year college, not a 4-year college, right? So it's going to be a different kind of group of students just to begin with. And then they'll likely have more home support if they are living, or less, or they live at home, which is worse. One of the two, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the UCI students that go to UCI are going to be a particular type of student who gets into UCI. One that can afford it. But then the other thing is that they also got the grade point averages to get in and everything else. So, I think that what you're doing now is you're kind of going through and just thinking about well, all right, so how do these students likely differ from other ones? And again, it doesn't invalidate the study, but it just means that when they go through and that they are looking at the results, is that they sort of have to either control for this, or what they have to do. For example, if you want to control for or see whether living at home was important, then what they could do is they could get UCI students who live at home and those who didn't live at home and compare the differences between them. Or they could get another sample. They could get UCI students and then they could get some from Orange County Community College and see if there's differences there. Okay, so understand representativeness, understand population. Here's some examples from the book. All podiatrists working. So let's say if the population that they're interested in is all podiatrists working in the state, and what they sample is 50 podiatrists at random for a job satisfaction survey. Is that a good way to sample? So if what you're interested in is all podiatrists in the state, and what they do is they just select randomly 50 podiatrists, is that a good way to sample? I'll put it this way, what's the problems with that way? What's the advantages and the disadvantages of that way of sampling? So what they're going to do is they're going to identify a podiatrist and send them a job satisfaction survey. Yeah. But in this case, that's okay because their population is podiatrists. So they're not worried about, because you're saying they don't know the job satisfaction of like ear, nose, and throat specialists or something like that. But in this case, that's okay because they're defining it as podiatrists as their population. Yeah. This proportion. Yeah. So if you want to get no, that's all right. If you want to get a representative sample, then the podiatrists in the states, right? Then how would you do it? Yeah. So why do you think geographic location might be important? Okay. So if you do it this way, then what you're doing is that you're just counting on that. You're just relying upon the random chance that you're going to get podiatrists from Central Valley, and you'll get some podiatrists from LA, and you'll get some from the Bay Area, right? Another way to do it would be to say, well, let's go through and just say we're going to send some to the podiatrists in the Central Valley, some podiatrists in LA, some to the Bay Area, and do it that way. So that's called a stratified sample. So what you're doing in that case is that you're stratifying it based upon characteristics that you think are important. So why do you think it is that characteristics of like the location might be important? So could be is that because the kind of the health system is different in those regions and the number of doctors is different, something like that. Mm-hmm. What else? What other factors might be important in terms of job satisfaction? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. So you have type of practice. Anything else so I mean, if you think about, because what you're doing is you're trying to think about what's the factors that I think are going to lead to job satisfaction. So if you think job satisfaction is going to be related to your location, how it kind of works. Your location, and that's important because it could just be people in Bay Area have better working conditions. Is that why location would be important? Okay. So it could be, it's a proxy then for pay and for other things like that. Type of practice. What else? Say a lot. Workload? Yeah, how would you? Good point. So this is called a medically underserved area. Medically underserved areas are like we're in a medically underserved area. So you could do it that way. Mm-hmm. What else? Age of the person. Age is part of the deal. Gender. Income. How much money they have. And that's part of it. Because what we're asking is like, what factors determine the job satisfaction? So you think, how much money you make, what your workload is, where you live, how old you are. Anything else? Yeah. Ethnicity? Yeah. And why would ethnicity?
Because maybe like some people feel more comfortable going like that.
So is this a proxy then for basically how much well, I'm trying to think of a nicer word than abuse, but how much sort of how close you are with your patient, how close you feel with your patients, or how patients interact with or relate to you? Is that? I mean, because it could be a lot of things, right? So that's why and it's okay to have something which is just a bigger category like this, to say, well, we're gonna go through and consider that, but just be aware of kind of like why it is that from location that you're worried about, the thing that you're concerned. So this is like a closeness with patients. Okay, so let's say we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you have 6 different things to care about, right? You got location, you got type of practice, you got age, gender, income, And then you think, okay, location, how many different, locations it would we care about? One sample. So Bay Area, San Francisco, San Joaquin Valley, Southern California, Coachella, that area, Central, Northern, someplace up north. So 6 things. How many different types do you think we're gonna have? Do I just do solo practice and within the group practice? Solo, and group. Age. How should we do age? Should we break it up into blocks? So maybe what? Up to 40? From 40 to 55 and then above 55? So less than 40, 40 to 55, greater than 55. And then this is gender, so do just 2. You could try to do a 30, and you could do, but the problem is that how are you gonna find enough people? So usually, it used to be just that was not a question that researchers asked. Now researchers do include other than male and female in there. But the problem usually is that unless you really go out there and try to oversample, because you could, a third category here, right? But the problem is that could you get enough people that podiatrists who are both identify as male and female? So typically what they do is they do female and males and others. And ethnicities. So I'd say white, African American, Hispanic, and then other. Usually the way that's done. Okay. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17. We have 17 different cells. And if you want to figure out how many different combinations there are, it's going to be 6 times 2 times 3 times 2 times 4. So that means that you've got the number of different types of cells that you have for this. 6 is 36 times 18. So that's 270. 270 different types of combinations of those things. So if you think, okay, well, we want to have enough people in each of these different types of groups to be able to say something. The minimum number of people that you usually want to have in a group to say something is about 30. So if you think 30, then you want to go to the 7,100. Somewhere around there. So this is the problem, right? So it means that sampling wise, it's often tough to sit there and think, well, what we're going to do is we're going to stratify the sample by every combination, make sure we have enough in every combination of need. Because you end up with, you'll need 7,100 podiatrists. And you have to then sample all these in a way to get all these different types of podiatrists. Like Rudy's doing a survey right now. You're getting people from San Joaquin Valley, LA, and San Francisco, right? Bay Area. And you want 100 from each places over 40. So the age over 40. So that's, the only restrictions are age is over 40 and 1 in 3 days. And it's turned out to cost a lot of money to get 100 people in the San Joaquin Valley for over 40. We're going to respond to a survey. So you can imagine is that if you're trying to do it this way, then you need to have like, you know, you need to be able to say, well, we're gonna get enough people who come from this location who have, you know, this type of practice, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes too complicated. Or it becomes very complicated. You can do it, I mean, probably not with podiatrists, but you could do it for, you know, if you wanted to do like a bigger survey, you could do it. But for a simple survey like podiatrists, is that you can't. And so instead, you do a random sample. And the idea, I mean, the advantage of a random sample is that, you know, you can't be sure you're going to get enough people in all these different types of cells, but you know, you're randomizing, so there's no reason why you to expect that you're going to get an unrepresented sample using a random sample. Okay. This is a job satisfaction survey. Is that going to be an issue? Is that, are we likely to get, you know, because what you want for a representative sample is like you want to be able to send it out to 50 people and that then all 50 people answer it, right? Now, in practice, there's what's called a response rate. A response rate is, you know, the number of people who answer the survey divided by the number of people who the survey is given. Or the app invited to take it. That's your response rate. You know, and what you'd like to have is 100% response rate. Means that everyone who was asked completed the survey. And then as you go down from 100%, now people are dropping off. I'm not doing it. And so one of the things you have to ask yourself when you look at a survey is you have to say, well, who is it that's not going to answer this, or who's more likely to answer it? So in this case, 50 podiatrists selected at random for a job satisfaction survey. Will all 50 respond, or who's more likely to respond? Like if you look at Yelp reviews, who's more likely to write a Yelp review? Yeah. Either really, really happy or really, really dissatisfied, right? Probably really dissatisfied. Yeah. And so it means that, you know, the reviews that you get, they're not a random sample of people who have used, you know, went to the restaurant or whatever, right? They're people who were probably pissed off because they went and they had a horrible experience. And so they want to write about that. So restaurants know this. So what do? And like, and all companies know this now. Like I had to call the bank the other day, and the bank at the end, the guy said, he said, you know, I really, really appreciate it if you took a survey just to tell how we did. So why are they so concerned with, after this 5-minute phone call, that I take a survey, tell them how they did? Well, because they know that the only people who really take surveys usually are people who are pissed off. And so if they look at what their response, I mean, what the survey responses are, it looks like everyone hates the bank because it's just a bunch of people who, you know, it's all negative comments. So what they do is they either hire people, the unethical ways that you hire people to give reviews. That's something that happens a lot. Or what you do is that you try and get everyone to give you a review and guilt them into it. And it's because they're trying to overcome this idea that for surveys like satisfaction surveys, it's usually people who are not very happy are the ones who complete the satisfaction surveys. Or people who are really happy, one of the two, but you don't get just the average person completing the survey. All pathologists working in the state. 25 pathologists selected for a detailed tax evaluation by an inspector. So that's what they're doing. They're trying to look at the taxes of pathologists. And so I'm going to invite 25 pathologists to participate. Who's going to participate? Will it be a representative sample? Who's not going to participate? Put it that way. Yeah, people are worried about what their taxes are like. Yeah. So the only people who are going to participate, well, it's probably no one would participate. But if someone would participate, it's probably just someone who is so sure that they're squeaky clean that they're not going to worry about having an audit come through. Okay. Temperature of patient during the 24-hour period. Hourly measurements reported by staff. Good way to do it. Depends, right? Probably if they came the same time every hour. Because what you have to ask yourself, is there any reason to think that them coming in at a certain point is going to misspell temperature? Them coming in at any point is going to cause some type of difference in the reading. Probably not. Blood pressure, blood pressure is an issue for when for trying to get accurate measures of blood pressure, because a lot of people, when someone comes to take the blood pressure goes up because they don't. It's called white coat syndrome. So it's a real problem because if you start to worry about, if you're someone who gets nervous when you see a nurse coming to take your blood pressure and your blood pressure goes up and the nurse says your blood pressure's up, the next time they come, you're going to be even more nervous. And so it sort of creates this problem about, well, how do you actually measure someone's blood pressure if the act of taking the blood pressure means that it goes up, means that you're not getting kind of a random sample. All right, let's see. Okay, so what you want is you want a representative sample, and what you want to do is that you want to make sure that it's that your sample reflects the characteristics of the group. So like in this case, podiatrist, the characteristic you care about is podiatrist. On the other hand, if you're talking about university students at UCI, then and that's who you're surveying, then you have to sort of just restrict yourself to say that, well, we're only talking about a certain subsector of university students. Okay. Suppose you wanted to examine stress among UC Merced students having academic problems. Who would be your population? Put it this way, how would you define your population? How would you define your population? How would you sort of identify who is it that has academic problems? Okay, so you could say certain students with a certain GPA. So let's say below 2.5. Okay, below 2.5. That's going to be your population. How would you go about sampling students like this? Depends, right? Depends if you're an academic advisor, then you just get people's GPAs, and then you approach them and say, we'd like to enroll you in this program. If you're not a student, if you're just doing it as a researcher, and that so you have to go out there and find students like this, and you don't observe their GPAs, then you have to ask, you have to sort of say, interested in students with lower GPAs to be part of the study. Are you going to get? Is that going to bias your sample? I mean, are you going to get a representative sample if you do it that way? Probably not, right? Probably, people are probably not going to be very willing to just self-identify as having academic problems. Yeah. So I'm sorry, say it louder. You could also do it where you just get everyone, right? Sample everyone. But then really what you're doing is you're going to screen students for academic problems. So therefore you don't come out and say, we're interested in all students. Could do it that way. Could be is that you offer them something, like you say, we'll give you academic support. So there are different ways you could do it along the way. How about if you want to study health impacts of pesticides on farm workers? how would you sample? Well, I mean, you could go all farm workers, right? So you could say, well, go to farm workers and then sample farm workers. Problem is that, you know, not all farm workers are exposed to pesticides, and not all people who I know that they're exposed to pesticides. And also, it's also really tough to test for pesticides, you know, because it's something for which it doesn't really show up in your blood. The only way to really do it is you have to get like first urine within 48 hours. First urine means, you know, peeing in the morning. So the first time they pee in the morning, and that when the within 48 hours of being exposed. So it's actually kind of tough to do. So the only way to really do it is just to ask people, have you ever worked on pesticides? And then have you had any problems and things like that? But the problem is that in this case, it's hard to go through to identify that, to make sure that people can actually identify that they have been exposed to pesticides. Okay. So a sample, couple terms to know. One is population validity, and the other one is ecological validity. So population validity means that your sample your findings can generate to your population. So whatever your sample is, it can generate to your population. So the UCI students, the study of UCI students, their population is university students, right? So if it means that if it has population validity, it means the results from UCI can translate to other universities as well. And then the other one is ecological validity, and that means it translates to other situations. So like in the case of the paper where it's looking at COVID and stress, is that the idea is that there would be, if another type of stressor came along besides COVID, you'd have a similar type of, the results would also count for that too. So it's not specific to just COVID. That's ecological validity. Did the study that you're reading about stress at UCI students, does it have ecological validity? Or does it have population validity? You know, how much do you trust that the results from the study on UCI students translates to other type of students as well? Do you trust it a lot, a little bit, or not at all? A little bit, so you're right in there. How about ecological validity? Do you think that, because this one's about COVID, will it count for other type? Will the results of this also be relevant for other types of disturbances? Things that can happen? Like global warming. Will the results for this be, could you also say, oh, well, it'll tell us something about what will happen to student stress into global warming? I don't think so. I mean, it's pretty specific to COVID. If you said, well, if another epidemic came through that had the same characteristics of, you know, everyone had to be locked down and things like that, then yes, then it would have ecological validity. But if not, it doesn't really translate to other things. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily, you know, it's not a problem in the sample in this case. It's just a problem with the actual condition itself. All right. Two basic type of sampling methods, probabilistic and non-probabilistic sampling. Probabilistic is when you use some type of randomized selection. Non-probabilistic is when you have some type of criteria. So this is non-probabilistic sampling. Just the random sampling where you just pick 50 people at random, that's probabilistic sampling. Simple random sampling, just give everyone a number and then say, you know, you just randomly call people. Advantage of that is that it's random, right? You're not imposing any type of restriction, any type of potential bias on experimental bias. Because like if you think about, you know, what we did, we sort of came up with a list of what we think is going to be important. And then we said, okay, we're going to sample based upon this. Well, what if we're wrong? What if we miss something that's really important? Then it means that we're randomizing other things that aren't important, and that we're not randomizing other things that are, you know, that we're not taking account things that are important in that case. So part of the problem when you start going from a purely random sample to a more of a non-probabilistic sample is that you as the as the researcher, are imposing things on them. That's okay in the case of if we say, well, we want to make sure we have enough females and males in the sample, or if we want to make sure that we have different age groups, you can do it if that's what you're interested in, but just be aware that you've lost the benefits of a pure random sample at that point. The other advantage of random sampling is that, essentially, because you're just randomizing, you're not randomizing over different type of conditions. It means that you don't have to have 7,100 different people that enough people need to sell. Instead, you're just randomizing over everyone. So it means that your large N's kind of give you more certainty. Systematic sampling is similar, but instead of what they do is that they go through and that they basically assign everyone something, and then they just do every fourth one. So this is done a lot for household surveys, where what they'll do is that they'll say, okay, we're going to go to a street, and every fourth house we're going to go to on that street, because they don't want to just sort of do all the houses just on one block, and they want to make it more of a within some type of a wider range, and so they just pick every fourth house and do it like that. Stratified sampling. This is stratified sampling. So now what you're doing is that you're kind of picking out now certain characteristics and saying we're going to sample based on those characteristics. And then cluster sampling is when you what you do is you identify a region and you say, okay, we're going to really heavily sample people in this region, but you then just sort of randomly select regions. So this is done a lot of schools. So if you think about if you're in LA and you want to do a study of school kids, you could either go through and randomly sample kids from all across LA schools, but you'd be getting 5, 6 kids per school, something like that. Or what you do is that you say, we're going to pick certain schools and we're going to heavily sample in those schools. And so that's typically when you have some type of thing that's like a unit, like a identifiable entity, is that you typically do cluster sampling like that. This is what they do for marketing a lot. So when I went to Santa Barbara as an undergraduate, and Santa Barbara, we used to get all of the beers that would, new beers that were coming out would be introduced in Santa Barbara. And finding out that, well, Santa Barbara was one of the spots. There was Santa Barbara and Peoria, Illinois, and someplace up in Vermont. And they had that certain locations that marketers would use to try new things, because they knew that this, in this case, it's a rich college town, is Santa Barbara. And so they would try it in the rich college town. They tried in Peoria. They tried in these various spots as a way of sort of seeing, is it going to fly? That's cluster sampling, because they're picking out a certain area and saying, okay, we're going to just inundate this area with ads and commercials and things like that and see if people like it before we introduce it to the entire country. All right. So sampling, the whole idea of when you look at a sample then is to identify biases. So learn the biases. We're going to go through, there's lots of different biases, but we're going to go through the major ones right now. So learn how to recognize these, because these are the things when I ask them to test. If I say, what's wrong with this sample, is that then, you're going to refer to one of these biases then as you're going through and tell me what's wrong with it. So the major one is self-selection bias. So self-selection bias means that people who, if you give out the survey to everyone, there's certain type of people who will respond to the survey and certain type who won't. So the podiatrist one, job satisfaction, that's a self-selection bias, because the people who want to respond to the survey are going to be those who are really, really upset or really, really unhappy with the job. Self-selection bias. Exclusion bias means what you're doing is that you are specifically excluding certain members of the population because of something, right? Some type of criteria. So the most extreme of this is survivorship bias, which means that people who are are sampled are the only ones kind of left in the group. So they can either be because they actually die or because they go through and that they just drop out along the way. So we did a study down here with Merced Public Health Department a few years ago about diabetes prevention programs, and that this is a big CDC's kind of program for diabetes prevention, has 22 classes, and that looked at all the results from it and found that it had these really, really high levels of success. As that, if you look at sort of weight loss after going through this program, it was really good, and diabetes, the percentage of diabetes went way down and everything else. So it all looks good. What they didn't mention is that there's a selection bias here, survivorship bias, because it's 22 classes. So most people drop out along the way. If you go through and you include in the people who dropped out, then it doesn't look as good. This is the same thing for like cancer treatments. Cancer treatments is that any type of treatment whereby you can have people die along the way, is that die or drop out. It means that just realize that at the end of it, you're only getting those people who are sort of successes, who were still in the sample. So let's go through a couple examples. We'll start off by going through. Okay, so this is the paper for your assignment. Structured or unstructured? Unstructured. So how did they, first off, notice is that this paper set up a little bit different. And what they do is that they have same part, first sentence, big sentence, end of it kind of goes down and narrows it down to what the study's about. And then the last sentence here basically says what they're doing, right? So that's still the same as other papers. But then they have this big section here, which is all about where they go through kind of what they mean by stressful events. So what they're doing in this case now is that they're coming through and they're explaining to you what they mean by stress. So, they could have written the paper basically without that. Yeah. Should be, right? This is the paper for your assignment, right? Is that right? Okay, good. Otherwise, you're probably all freaking out wondering why I'm talking about this paper. But this is the paper for your assignment. So they go through and they talk about what stress means. And then you come down here to the sample, to how they sampled, right? So the current study down here. So how did they go through and sample? Who participated in the study? How many people did they sample? Right? 1,275 people. Did they do it one time or did they do it repeated times? What's that? Repeated. How many times did they repeat? 4 times, right? So they had 1,275 undergraduates consented to participate in a longitudinal study. What's a longitudinal study? We'll go through this next week, but what's 2 weeks? But what's a longitudinal study? That's where you follow people up over time. It's a longitudinal study. So in this case, they start off with 1,275 people, and that they then gave them a survey. And then how many people were actually involved in that? And do they report data for? 274, right? This number here. So this is the data that they actually have, right? So the N in this case is 274. What happened to the other 1,001 people? Yeah, some of them dropped out, some probably just didn't respond back several times. And it's not really clear, at least it wasn't clear to me, why they, whether these 274 people were people who were a subsample that they collected, or whether it was everyone that they did, but only 274 people actually were there for the entire 4 times. Let's say that they start off with 1,275 and they end up with 274. What's their response rate? How would I figure out their response rate? What is it? The response rate is equal to 10 to the million. It's equal to something divided by something else. What? 74 divided by 1275. That's the response rate. So it's going to come out to be about what, maybe 20%? Something like that. Is that good or bad? 20% response rate, good or bad? Normally you'd say bad, right? Because you would think, well, I mean, response rates, you usually like to have response rates for like 60%, 70% is usually sort of seen as a good response rate. In this case, it's a little bit tougher because you're asking people to do it 4 times and you're asking them to do it during COVID. So, okay, maybe, but what type of bias might exist because of this? The biases that we just went through. What type of biases might exist? Yeah. Survivor bias. Because, basically you're only going to include people who were there for all 4 of the different types of surveys and completed. Any other type of bias? That explanation says only 274 people were actually there for all 4 of them. But it's also possible is that there's another group of people who were there for all 4 who just didn't answer all 4 of them. What kind of bias is that? Select the right answer. Selection bias. It's a selection bias, right? Because in this case, then, there's only certain people who are willing to do it. Are the people who are willing to answer all 4 times, are they likely to be different than the people who dropped out? Like, who is likely to have dropped out? So we're given a survey about stress. Who's likely to have dropped out? Say that. Yeah, first years or people under stress, right? If you're under stress and you're, especially time stress, and you're being asked to fill out a survey, is that you might think, I don't have time to do this. So who would have time to do it? People who maybe weren't as stressed because of it. How could you go through and, could they go through and test this? Could they, how would you test that? How would you test to see whether or not there was a survivor, survival bias? Because remember what we're talking about. It means that you go like this. You have the first survey will have 1275 people. The second survey may have 500. The third may have 400. And the fourth will have 274. And that's what that basically is. What you look at response rates. So they include these people here in the analysis. But if you wanted to see whether these people were different, then what you could do is you can compare basically all these people who dropped out here and then see are they different than the people who did that. That's actually, there's a type of analysis called that. what's called survivor analysis that they use. It's used a lot whenever they do some type of anything where people might, where your endpoint is someone dropping out of something. Is that then you can go through the survivor analysis to basically say, are these people different than these people? And are these people different than these people? And are they different than those people? That's the way you can test for it. Did they do that here? I don't think so. I didn't really see they did, and I didn't really see an explanation for why it is that they didn't do it, but but that would be the way to kind of handle it. Okay. Student characteristics. So that's the characteristics of the 274. I assume, see, they don't give an N here. Usually on the table they give the N, but they didn't really give the N here. So in this case, I'm assuming this is the 274, and this is all the undergraduates at UC Irvine. Are the people in the study different than these people who are in the general population? Maybe a little bit, but not a great deal. It looks like they have more females, right? And that they have, more more Hispanics, but other than that, there's not huge differences, it seems, within that. So then the reason why you do this is because you're looking to see, does the sample basically look representative? Does it basically look representative of the population? So that's why they put this table in there. Okay, then they go through and they list all these things: psychological distress, self-regulation, etc. And then they get their statistics. And then this is their main result here, right? So this shows the stress levels over the different types of the four things. So on this, so show me by your thumbs, how confident are you that you know what the dependent variables are? To, I'm very confident I know what the dependent variables are. To, I'm not very confident I know what the dependent variables are. Right? That was the question on the assignment. So how confident are you? Show me with your thumbs. Confidence levels. What's an independent variable? What's one of the independent variables? Here, they say up here that here we go. Student self-reported gender was included as a covariate in each model. What does that mean? Is self-reported gender an independent or a dependent variable? Independent variable, right? Because does gender cause stress, or does stress cause gender? Or are there differences? Does being under stress change your gender, or does your gender determine, help predict your stress? Because that's the question asked, right? Since your gender helps predict your stress, factor 1 and factor 2, it means that gender is an independent variable, and stress is the dependent variable, right? So what are these things here? These beginning the survey dates, independent or dependent? Why? Because the stress doesn't determine doesn't determine what the season or the interview. So then when you get down here to this table, right? This is table 2. Let's go to table 3. Here's table 3. These things here going down this way. Independent or dependent? Independent. And typically, like I said, usually independent things are along the rows, and your dependent things are usually the topic of the survey, the table. So these are independent. These things here, independent or dependent. Survey dates. Guess that's a question. Clear? Any questions about this article? I gave you a couple papers to read. Honesty time. How many read the papers? Show me. I read both papers carefully versus I glanced at the papers versus papers. Were there papers? Okay. Read them for next time. Okay, because we're going to go through, there's two papers. There's this one and that one. And we'll go through the independent variables, dependent variables, and the sampling and what type of sampling problems arise. But you can see the types of questions I'm going to ask. I'm going to say, so tell me what the paper was about. How did they get people? When did they do it? What were their dependent variables? What were the independent variables? Good? These questions are remarkably similar to what I'm going to ask you in the midterm. So that's why, yeah. And the only way to learn it is basically just to sit down and read the paper and try to think about it. Good? Okay, so we'll start there next time. And we'll go through that. We'll go through these two papers. And I'll feel free to, I will assume that all of you will have read it. Yes.
So really quick, just now at 10 a.m. that was